Welcome to the launch of Revisiting Museums of Influence, 4 decades of innovation and public quality in European museums. I'm Sharon Heal. I'm the Director of the Museums Association in the UK and a member of the European Museum Forum Board. And I'm delighted that we have the 3 editors of this volume here with us today for the launch. I'm going to invite each of the editors to share some initial thoughts on innovative and influential museums and how this book came about, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions of the panel. Please use the Q&A function for this. We have people with us here today on Zoom in the audience, and the event is also being live streamed on YouTube. I think the pandemic, as well as being a huge challenge for museums, has also provided a moment of reflection, a moment where we should all be asking what kind of museums does society need, and how can we become socially useful and purposeful organisations? Also, when our world is contracted and narrowed, I think it's useful and necessary to expand our minds and our thinking by looking at international best practice. And this book is a very useful tool for doing this. I'm going to start by introducing Jette Sandahl, who is the chair of the European Museums Forum, which oversees the European Museum of the Year Award. She was previously founding director of 2 pioneering museums, the Women's Museum of Denmark and the Museum of World Cultures in Sweden. She was also the director of exhibitions and public programs at the National Museum of Denmark and director of experience at Te Papa in New Zealand, amongst other roles. Jette, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. I'll briefly talk about what you called how this book came about. It started at after the award ceremony of the European Museum Award in 2018, when Hartmut Prasch, a former EMYA judge and former EMF trustee, came up to me as the then very new EMF chair and said, Jette, you got to do a sequel to Ken Hudson's Museum of Influence. You need to do Museums of Influence too. And this idea fit really well with the efforts the board had started developing in exploring the 40 years of EMYA judging and systematic museological analysis of the needs that drive, create, and sustain museums as public and civil spaces. So we decided to do a publication drawing on this intellectual legacy. As anyone who came into his personal orbit, I was strongly impacted by Ken Hudson himself as a person of influence. To be seen, to be recognized by him had, I think, tremendous intellectual and political effect on generations of museum leaders in Europe. He wrote, and not least taught, and some might say pontificated, on a wide range of subjects. In the context of EMYA, he underscored the societal purpose, obligations, and commitment that are now, over the last half century, gradually becoming mainstream. The shorthand version of these became the concept of public quality, that is the general atmosphere meeting visitors and what they would experience, enjoy, and take away with them as food for thought. In his writing and as a person, Kenneth personified the dual parameters of an award scheme, the ability at the same time to be both profoundly critical and discerning, and to be deeply appreciative and celebratory of the achievements of each museum in its specificity and particularity. In the new publication, the Revisiting Museums of Influence, we took our point of departure in the multifarious voices of the EMYA juries that over the years have contributed to this accumulated collective base of insight. The body of the publication is thus a series of portraits of candidate museums from 1977 to 2019, written by former and current judges. As editors, the 3 of us brought together a group of writers, making sure to include different periods, different regions of Europe, different museum affiliations, scientific disciplines, gender, age. We asked for portraits of museums that have been most memorable for them as judges, museums that had stayed with them over time and become points of reference for them, museums that had influenced them. The 51 museum portraits in the book bear witness to the intensity with which Each visit is imprinted in the judge's memories, as well as to the underlying values and criteria driving the process and filtering the perception. Framed and rooted in the close relationship to the Council of Europe, EMYA is embedded in an explicit set of social and humanitarian values, including those of citizenship and democracy, human rights, intercultural dialogue. How these values evolve and are interpreted over time is one of the dynamic and interesting undercurrents running through the book. But I believe we need, and this is what you were asking also, Sharon, I believe we need again to reinterpret or re-examine some of these values, or take a critical look at whom we include in them, look at for whom we grant them validity, who has a right to culture, what does justice mean? Every year in EMYA, we have candidate museums dealing in depth with repression, wars, and intra-European conflicts, as we do in this publication. We have very few candidates in EMYA, and even fewer in the book, that conceptualize or address historical and current conflicts between a European heritage and continents, cultures, and people from outside Europe. There's a near absence in European museums and in this book of themes of colonialism, which are so strongly contested in a broader international discourse. At this point of time, for me, the dilemmas of working with European perspectives and European museum collections without referencing their global context are increasingly intensified. And I assume that this is one of the subjects we will return to later.
Thank you, Jette. That was really useful, I think, for showing that very rich vein of intellectual content and discussion and debate that comes right through from the founding of the EMYA Awards and from Kenneth Hudson's original book and concept to where we are now. But also I really appreciate the idea of critical appraisal and a thinking through of what next, and where does the prize go, where do the awards go, and where do museums go. And I also appreciate the fact that the book is multi-authored, multivocal, and also multi-edited in perspective. So I think that's something that's really unique, I think, in the perspectives in the book, in the portraits in the book, which is really useful. So I'm going to go on now to Marlen. Marlen, you are, sorry, I just need to find the correct notes. Marlen Mouliou is the chair of judges for the European Museum of the Year Awards, an assistant professor of museology at the National Kapodistrian University of Athens, and vice chair of the European Academic Heritage Trust. She has previously served as a secretary and chair of the International Committee for the Collections and Activities of Museums and Cities. Marlen, can I hand over to you now, please?
Thank you very much, Sharon, for this introduction. And I would like to start by really thanking my colleagues and co-editors Jette and Mark for the opportunity and joy I had to work with them in this book project. We really spent hours and hours of creative time together online during the first and second lockdown. And fortunately, also just before the outbreak in Jette's lovely Danish home, planning for the book. I would like also to thank all the museums that have provided visuals for this book, and of course also my colleagues in the EMYA community with whom I coexist in the last 5 years, during which the experience of visiting dozens of innovative museum projects in Europe, discussing them with their production teams, and then with my dear fellow judges in our long and most interesting meetings, has been memorable in itself in my already long career in the museum sector. Right from the start, I would like to give a special emphasis on the duality of meaning in the title of the book, Revisiting Museums of Influence. Revisiting the museums we had the chance to visit as judges, and revisiting the alma mater of this book, the predecessor, the Museums of Influence, which interestingly has been one of my very first museum books I acquired as a very young master student of museology. I bought it in November 1991 without foreseeing, of course, that 25 years later I would be involved with EMYA. Of course, this has been not only one of the earliest museological publications, but also a book of influence in itself, with its multitude of carefully selected examples and Hudson's sharp and witty critical views. In his introductory pages, Hudson claimed that the museums of influence are museums which have broken new ground in such an original or striking way that other museums have felt disposed or compelled to follow their example. He also stressed that museums of influence should have significant and worthwhile originality, and that each one of them, by its mere existence, approach, and style, should meet a real social need, either on a national or international level. This, of course, implied that the influence of these pioneering institutions would have been felt by the general public, by their visitors, and not only by other museums. Not less significantly, Hudson warned museums that if they did not dig deeply into their history, their current needs and future aspirations, then their social relevance would eventually be questioned. And he often commented on the diversity of museums and museum practices around the world and the importance of balancing what he could call today the divide between localization and globalization. And this was so because he claimed museums take on the coloring of the society in which their capacity, their activity takes place. So Hudson also highlighted the danger of internationalism arising from the ease of traveling and information dissemination, which would influence museums everywhere so that they would end up looking and feeling much the same. In the Revisiting Museums of Influence book, although a minimally uniform style in the presentation of the 50 portraits of the 51 museums was required in order to create a coherent structure for the book, what turned out really strong and clear is the plurality of stories. A plurality of stories told by a plurality of different museums of influence as selected by fellow judges. And in fact, this is an indication of a significant achievement, I think. And to borrow and paraphrase a little bit the words of a famous Nigerian author in order to describe our book project, I think this was about how not to tell a single story, but rather bring forward a balance of stories. Stories are often defined by how they are told, when told, who told them, and how many of them are there to enjoy. And so I think the Revisiting Museums of Influence is a book with multiple museum stories told by different museum judges of different backgrounds and walks of life. I asked two colleagues from Greece to talk about the book. I knew that they purchased the book, and I asked them to give me their first impressions. One expressed her enthusiasm for the book, stating that it stands out as a very important guide for museum professionals and museum lovers, for it manages to present in a dense, personal, direct way, like a travel diary in a way, the stories of the judges. And their impression from the museums. It felt like a Euro trip for museum lovers. It didn't have unnecessary arduous extra information. Its portrait focused on the essence of every museum, offering to book readers several incentives and insights for personal exploration of the museums. And my second critical friend and book reader, who is a museum designer, found the book extremely useful, also because such a style of book, combination of content and visuals, are not usually available in the book market. All the texts are to the point and not at all overwhelming. They offer just the right information for every museum. And as previously said, they are good appetizers for the real visit to come. For us, the judges, Hudson's empirical wisdom is, of course, still relevant today, and his mix of parameters to assess the public quality of museums remains the connecting thread for our museum assessment from the point of view of visitors. Personally, I have been following EMYA's work for a long time, long before I joined the panel of judges, not only for learning more about the candidate museums and the diversity of types and approaches, but mostly for better understanding the evaluation grid EMYA has elaborated over the years to assess the candidates. And to finish, a few words more about Hudson. He said he had noted that the definition of quality is a very complex matter, and perhaps what mattered most in every aspect of life is what he said, the feel-good factor. And so he composed a short definition for the museum, for a good museum, for which he felt very proud. He used to say that a good museum was one from which one would go out feeling better than one went in. To bring this definition to the 21st century reality and challenges by adding just one word, I would propose revisiting the definition by adding just this one word. I think a good museum or museum of influence is one from which one goes out feeling a better person than one went in, a better citizen, an active citizen engaged with all the social matters that matter to us today. And I think in this book, we have exactly the kind of museums, this kind of museums presented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marlen, and thank you for sharing your first experience of the Kenneth Hudson book. I can really remember the first time I saw the book. I was working at the Museums Association. I'd just become the editor of Museums Journal, and I was asked to lecture on the history of museums. So I was frantically going through the books that we had in our basement, in our very small library in the Museums Association offices, and I came across the Kenneth Hudson book and read his introduction and his thoughts about the social purpose and use of museums. And it really struck me at that time that he was writing decades before I was reading, but still then thinking about what is the use and purpose of a museum in society, and what does quality mean in terms of the visitor experience and the impact. So it's really nice to hear your reflections on that, and also your colleagues' reflections on the new title as well. So I'm going to go now to our final panelist. Mark O'Neill is a European Museum of the Year Awards judge, an independent researcher and consultant, and former head of Glasgow Museums. He's also an associate professor of the College of Arts at Glasgow University, a research fellow at the Museum Studies Department at the University of Leicester, and an advisor for event communications. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. In the traditional manner, the three editors haven't, of course, coordinated what they were going to say, and Marlen and Jette have used up almost all my material. But I want to pick up on this idea of museums serving a social purpose, as opposed to museums just being what museums are and doing museum-y things for museum-y people. I mean, that tension was shot through the recent debate in ICOM about the redefinition of museums. There was a kind of everybody knows what museums do faction, and there was other people who said that you have to have a purpose. And that debate actually goes right back to the beginning. What people think of now as traditional museums often started off as social innovations with huge ambitions to benefit society, until they were taken over by staff who ran it for the sake of themselves, really, and the people they identify with. But looking at some of the portraits in the book, the first one is by Massimo Negri, and he's writing about the first European Museum of the Year Award winner in 1977, which is Ironbridge Gorge Museum, which was meeting a social need partly to preserve important historical remains. But I think it was also meeting a social need for the mourning, for the loss of the industrial culture, which was disappearing. The Thatcherite revolution was just around the corner when industrial culture would be swept aside, huge unemployment in traditional industries. So you could see that museum as being a kind of transitional therapy. Whereas the essay about the Alta Museum in Norway, written by Anne Nichols, who was one of the founders of EMYA, that was very much about the recovery of heritage that was destroyed during the Nazi occupation. I don't know where the Alta Museum is now. The Ironbridge Gorge Museum, because of the passage of time, has become a very good standard museum. It doesn't have a that same initial social purpose has been gone. In some ways it's done its work. And some of the later museums in the portraits, like Marlen's portrait of the War Childhood Museum, or Misha Gnadowski's portrait of the Museum of the Finnish Civil War, they're going on to meet new social needs. The essay by Patrick Green on the Chester Beatty Library about religion and society, again, that's a new emerging needs. Whereas Wim van der Weyden's essay about the Eureka Science Center was very innovative at the time, learning from America, as a lot of these things do, but that was addressing the need for scientific literacy in society. So all these museums basically worked out what they thought society needed and sort of rebooted what a museum could be in order to address those issues. I'm tempted to go on and say what I think society needs from museums now, but maybe we can come back to that, and maybe that's probably enough for me.
It was very short and sweet, Mark, and we will definitely come back to some of those questions, because the thing that struck me in the introduction, many things struck me in the introduction and the subsequent chapters, but the reference to how museums have long helped society with what I think you describe as transition therapy, dealing with losses and rapid social change. So I will come back to that question. But in reading the book and looking at the diverse portraits of museums from, as people have already mentioned, the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo, which I was lucky enough to visit a few years ago, and as Marlen's chapter says, is indeed a memorable and very human-centred museum. I think you couldn't fail but to be moved when you walk around that museum and engage with the objects there. But also the museums in the UK, which I'm familiar with. My first question is around what impact the previous winners have had. So how influential have these museums actually been? So does anybody want to start on that one?
I can say a few words. I think we can see the influence in many levels. We know that some museums have been star museums, like the Guggenheim in Bilbao. It's an example par excellence of a museum and soft power and how museums can regenerate the city. So it is one of the examples of the book, and of course very much discussed in literature and in our sector about its huge impact. But influence is something extremely broad and relative as well. And we cannot trace how influential a museum can be in our lives, in every visitor's life. A museum, for instance, I can bring the example of the Conservation Centre in Liverpool, a museum that I think is the only example from the book that this museum does not exist anymore. It's somehow merged with other museums in Liverpool. But if I can talk personally, it was very influential for me back then as a student, because I could see the potential of a science, of a discipline coming forward to the public and presenting its backstage workings in a very interactive and very engaging way. And even if a museum does not exist anymore, to have this incentive at a certain point in time in your career or as a visitor, I would think the same for many visitors of the War Childhood Museum, that they go and get connected with the objects and the stories. They leave transformed from the museum. They leave very, very moved and moved in the way that they want to get back active in society. So the influence can be either within the museum sector, as a good example that other museums are there to follow, like the Museum of Innocence or the Museum of Broken Relationships, and how influential these have been for other similar museums with different stories, or influence really impactfully every visitor in a different way.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because obviously we're going through the book, the Conservation Centre is now closed, the whole building is closed. So the book serves as a record of some of these institutions and where they were at a particular moment in time. So from a museological point of view, the sector is very fond of looking at our own history and thinking about where we were at. But I'm interested in also the latter point about social purpose and influence in terms of audiences. And I think that's where the kind of the beauty of some of these examples lies. But also picking up on your earlier point, Jette, how do we reflect critically on whether these institutions are still influential or playing that role?
If I were to take up that thread, when I had visited the fabulous Baxi Museum, which sort of emerges as a mirage in the furthest corner, eastern corner of Anatolia, I came back asking myself this, can a museum serve as what I call a museological model of you know, is it possible to duplicate this somewhere else? Can there be a recipe for hope, I ask then. And I think that the interesting thing is that really innovative museums, really original, excellent museums, are often deeply personal, expressing the vision of a founding individual or founding group of people who come together in this sort of seamless creative collective. But I do think that identifying diverse components, diverse connections that have merged and blended to make a place so excellent can actually act not as a blueprint, not as a recipe, but as inspiration, principles, standards, checklists even for creating museums that matter to their communities and which support their communities in finding their own place and their own voice in these often very conflicted and complex contexts. And for me, I think that is what the book attempts to do, is identify these components that we can actually transfer. And I think that is the way that influence sort of happens bit by bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. It's the ingredients, isn't it? So yes. You can't take the War Childhood Museum and put it in Belfast, even though there may have been very many similarities of childhood and growing up in a conflict. But what you can do is say, here's a museum that tells a story in a really innovative way that moves you and makes you, as you say, Marlen, want to do something and be active in society. So it's the ingredients that make up the piece that I think that those form the threads that run through many of the portraits in the book. Mark, did you want to say anything more on this?
Well, it just occurs to me, I'm looking at the list of the 51 museums from, I think it's 24 countries, and most of them are actually new museums. Mm. And I think anybody who's worked in the sector in 6 weeks would know that it's much easier to create a new museum, be innovative, than to change an old one. And I think the institutional traditions and the weight of the past in long-established museums means that being genuinely innovative instead of in the sense of responding to social needs is very difficult. It's interesting, Massimo also wrote an essay on the British galleries in the V&A, which won the award in 2003. And that was, I think, a reasonably successful attempt to re-energize the V&A, which had been set up in the 1850s with radically democratic ambitions to train the working class. After foreigners, non-British people won most of the awards in the Great Exhibition of 1851. But as soon as the radical sort of charismatic director of the kind Jette talked about, Henry Cole, retired, the curators took over, they stopped, edited out the large working class audience that they had, made it clear they were unwelcome. The V&A kind of renewed itself in 2003, and since then it's reverted to being, you know, a very nice place to have coffee and buy things in the very nice shop with, I mean, it's very professional, very high standards of visitor services and everything, but its demographic is, I can't remember the exact figures, 80% of their visitors have postgraduate qualifications. It's that kind of setting. So innovation, you can be inspired by these new entries into the sector by visionary individuals, but driving change within existing museums, as you can see from, well, I won't talk on behalf of my colleagues, but it has certainly aged me.
Thank you, Mark. That does provide a very neat segue into another question. And I want to quote from the introduction to the book here, in which it says, many celebrated examples of engagement with disenfranchised audiences are sustained by exceptional additional funding so that they never become core and cease when the money dries up. What museums really value is revealed during times of financial cutbacks. Well, that's very timely for the situation that we're in now. So I suppose my question is, following on from some of the points that have been made, is it possible to embed change and meet those needs of wider society. How do we do that, and where are the examples of that?
I could give an example.
Mm-hmm.
I think, talking about institutional change, I mean, every year we have candidates telling us you have to do it all at the same time. If you do bits by bit, it's not going to work. You have to change everything across the board simultaneously, which I think is also my experience. So that's the process of change. But I think we need to talk also about the values that set the direction and drive the direction for these changes, because we're not interested in change for change's sake. And I think a good example here would be, again, one of the portraits, the European Solidarity Center in Gdansk, which is a museum. It's excellent. It's almost sort of a paradigmatic example of a museum that is anchored and embedded in its surroundings, driven and governed by its mission and values, and cohesive and consistent in its commitment from research to programming, from high-level international partnerships to serving the needs of its quite local residents. Stages dialogues on what does democracy mean on all these different levels. And I think that comprehensive, all-encompassing approach is the only way to create these changes that are embedded both within, but also in the external relationships in the community that the museum exists in. So the values are really core. Mm-hmm. And as I know new museums, you spend a lot of time getting your value base right, and then the rest is much, much easier.
Mm-hmm. So that's really fantastic reflections, Jette. So it is absolutely values first, mission, vision, values, mm-hmm. and then it is almost dismantling the organisation and rebuilding it. And I think there's something in there about how much the community has voice and agency, mm-hmm. or how much your target audience has voice and agency in that reassembling of the museum and putting the building blocks back together. Mark or Marlen, do you have?
I would add to that, I think there is an extra element of the right timing for change, the fortunate time to change, because some museums may want to go through change for a long time, or we know through stories, even in the portraits, museums that have started the process of being created for a long time, but this long time was really long, and the change was not coming forward. And then suddenly something happens, and you have the museum in its best way. This change perhaps has started before, but the timing, and I mean, when I mean timing, I don't mean only for the museum. I mean for the society, that the society is ripe, and the societal matters are there to create the project and find all the elements that are necessary to make a big and innovative project. And I bring in mind, for instance, the Silesian Museum in South Poland. I visited in 2017, I think, which is exactly in a museum that was for a long time into creation, but only 1999, when the mines closed down and the whole area needed regeneration, actually opened up an opportunity for a museum to happen there. And the museum, not in the way that it would have happened 10 years before, but as the society needed it there at the change of 2 centuries, at the threshold of the 21st century, with a completely different framework of and mindset of work. And of course, the right people. It's also how fortunate museums are to have the right human ingredients in their workforce. And I see this a lot, that when a team works together, of course with a vision and mission in their heads, but they share this vision and values, and the team works well, the project is extremely fortunate.
Yeah, absolutely right. So 2 other ingredients we have for embedding change or creating an institution that is socially focused is the people and the leadership, and it has to be from the top as well as including the whole of the staff and the volunteers and the people and the community around it. But also I'm interested in that idea of timeliness as well. I think that's really critical, either timeliness for a single institution in terms of creation or change, but also timeliness, as you say, in wider society, because I certainly think now is one of those times. I've never heard in the sector as much conversation about the purpose, the role, why a museum exists, who it exists for, and how do we serve our audiences, and how do we play a part in the recovery when we get to a sort of post-pandemic period. Mark, were you going to reflect on some of those issues?
Yes. I mean, well, I have a big fear that as soon as society opens up, people will forget the crisis. I mean, I don't know what happened in the rest of Europe, but during the Second World War in Britain, museums were incredibly innovative, and apart from the Nationals in London, which were closed, of course, but out here in the provinces, I'm based in Scotland, there was all sorts of engagement with factory workers and soldiers on leave, and really innovative programs. And within 2 years of the end of the war, it all stopped. People went back to doing things properly, and most of the innovations had to be reinvented in the 70s and 80s. So I think we could easily waste this crisis. I think the thing about people is really interesting. One of my favorite, I don't read many management books, but the one that I like is Collins's Good to Great. And he says, actually, before you start the vision, you need to get the right people, because you can't do the vision with the wrong people. Which means if you're taking over a really moribund institution, you might have to do it on your own. If you can't get the right people. He has a separate book on public sector and how hard it is to change staff in government organizations, and there are ways of dealing with that. But so getting the right people, getting a team that wants to drive the change and engage the public, as well as the staff who are up for the change. I think the other thing is theory, or in a sense of analysis. A museum is only as good as its analysis of society. If you think we're a museum, we do the museum things, we collect, we interpret, we research, and people can come and take it if they want. That is not an analysis of society. That's just, well, neoliberal economists would call it rent seeking and provider capture. That's you living off society by doing what you want to do. So even the things as basic as you're talking about, which are fairly standard now, about community consultation before you renew, who you choose to consult, the depth of that engagement, all of that is based on your analysis of who is significant, who the stakeholders are. So unless you have an analysis of what society's needs, can you then really think creatively about what could an innovative museum contribute to developing that society?
So more ingredients there, and I share your concerns about this being an opportunity, but also potentially the potential for missing the opportunity. And thank you, Mark, you pointed me in the direction of Catherine Pearson's book on museums and the Second World War, which really does map out in the UK what happened in terms of the real flowering of community engagement and social purpose, and the use of institutions and collections, and then what happened afterwards. But it's good to be aware of that in order to hopefully not replicate that cycle of questioning and thinking about doing things differently, and then returning to the way that they were done before. We are getting some questions through in the Q&A, but just one more about the role of museums and the particular events of the last year. So in the introduction, you referenced the fact that museums have long helped society in what might be called transition therapy, dealing with the losses brought about by rapid social and economic change. There has been a lot of change in the last year, unprecedented change in society. So what impact do you think that has had on museums, and possibly more importantly, what impact will that have on how they respond to that change?
Well, their immediate impact and the change was the way they operate. We have seen this through the summer when we managed to do some of the visits for the current candidates for the awards, that a lot of museums that have been developing their projects in very interactive and multisensorial way, engaging the public, their physical body in the museum, had to rethink a lot in order to keep the measures, the health and safety measures as requested. And this is a big issue. And for me, it's a very big open question of how museums can reoperate in a multi-sensorial way. It's something that we wanted to conquer for many years, and we started doing that. And now a greater power tells us that this is not the right thing to do. Also, the use of space, the use of actual space of the museum will change. Perhaps some museums will rethink a lot about certain things that need now and they didn't need in the past, or vice versa. And of course, more than anything is how museums engage with their public. We've seen that museums that have stayed open, and I mean really open to society, were the museums that have been very proactive in finding creative new ways to engage and bring the public as co-creators of their work. And this is something we knew and we experienced a lot in physical museums, not only in their digital versions, but this crisis really reflected even more how important it is to get the visitors engaged. So I think this is a way to go, and perhaps this is a way museums will certainly survive, even if they have financial risks at the moment.
And I think that's a critical question, isn't it? You know, how relevant are we deemed to be as museums when there's a huge crisis? Jette?
I think we should also probably look a little at the differences between what happens in the UK and what happens on mainland Europe, because when you talk about the immense changes or potential for change over the last year, I think 2020 has not brought quite the same discussions in mainland Europe. I think the whole, what you call the impact of Black Lives Matter, that whole tradition of looking at who is really represented and how and under what conditions and in which ways and how exploitative, etc. That discussion is a lot stronger in the UK than it is on mainland Europe. I would like to, you know, the photograph here is from the MACTA Museum in Guadeloupe. And I think I would like to mention that as an example here, because I think it's the one that has the strongest change in epistemology. The whole idea of self-representation has never really taken hold in European museums the way it has in other areas of the world where people who are misrepresented or underrepresented have, you know, demanded a voice in museums. And I think the MACTA is interesting because the racialized other speaks in a really clear first-person voice in the MACTA. And I think, you know, I was thinking today, every European museum should start saving up for a ticket to go to Guadeloupe or to invite someone to come speak in the museum, because we tend to think that it's the descendants from enslavement that should work with these issues and not the white European institutions. And I think that sense of responsibility and accountability has to be broadened. And I think that for me is one of the really core issues of 2020. And I think the MACTA sets up a number of roadmaps and ways of working with these processes that for shorthand we could call decolonization. Yeah.
And I think that's, I'm really glad you've raised that portrait from the book, because it's a really interesting one. And the whole area of decolonization is one which is the new area of museum practice. I think, it's much contested as a concept, but lots of museums now are working and thinking in that area, and also being much more humble about the knowledge within the institutions and the perceived knowledge within the collections, knowing that actually the knowledge is without the walls of the institution and outside of the collection as well. Matt, did you have any thoughts on that issue of the future, or how we take some of the learning of the last 12 months?
Well, I'm tempted to follow the thread picked up by Jette, but I'll go back to the most striking thing about lockdown is that museums were the first to close and the last to open up in most countries, which suggests to me that people who make difficult and big decisions see museums as nice to have and not essential, which is probably true in most cases. They don't really address the essential issues of our time. So the next time there's a crisis, if we want to stay open, and if you think of public places where people can be 2 meters distance, where they can be safe, there are few institutions which have the experience of museums. I don't know, in looking around in the museum, the main museum and art gallery in Glasgow, there's probably a couple of €100 million worth of paintings on the wall, most of them unglazed. They're perfectly safe because we're used to managing the crowds. So if we are to be a civic space that can safely remain open in the next pandemic or whatever the next social crisis is, we have to get ourselves higher up the agenda. And that can only be done by being more necessary, because we're not necessary enough at the moment.
Yeah, we absolutely have to be needed and relevant by our communities, and they have to be making the clamour to politicians. We need our museums reopened as soon as possible. So I'm just going to pick up on a couple of the questions in the Q&A. Marlen, you mentioned the evolution of the judging process, and there's been interest in this in the questions. How would we describe the arc of the evolution of the judging criteria? What do you imagine the next edition of the book will focus on? Well, let's just stick with the judging criteria because that's quite specific, and also who chooses the judges and on what basis does this provide an interesting narrative about changing perception of what makes a great museum? So just if we can answer those questions about how the judging process has evolved and how we see it evolving, and where do the judges come from? What criteria do we use to choose the judges?
Jette, would you like to go ahead for the criteria of choosing the judges?
I can start talking about choosing the judges from the board side, since it's now been a while since I was a judge. We try to make a jury that is as diverse as possible. And that concept of diversity will have many, many different dimensions. Regionality has been a really important one. There's in the introduction, there's quite a bit about the East and West coming together in the award scheme. So that regionality has been an important parameter, East, West, North, South. Scientific disciplines is also one that we want to see is represented. Types of museum affiliation, or possibly some non-museum affiliated people have also been in there. Age, we begin to look at also in terms of ethnic cultural diversity much more than we have before. Sexual identity affiliation, we begin to expand that concept of what diverse means. And then, of course, and this comes, I think, could be a bridge into Mark or Marlen talking about the criteria. It's never enough that you conform to these formal criteria. You also have to be really good. You have to be really thoughtful. You have to be able to read a museum in depth and not sort of impose your opinions or criteria or preferences in a sort of ideological way. you have to really be able to sense and savor and appreciate that museum. And some of this is very intuitive.
I would agree a lot with the last point also, of how much intuitive is the judgment as well. I feel that there is a generic structure of the criteria based on which we assess the museums. They are quite broad, and this is good because within this broadness, we have the flexibility to innovate our judgment and adjust it based on also what the museums offer and how they evolve within the field. So this mix of criteria, this package of museum qualities is like the foundation bricks. But then we build according to the new possibilities of the museums, and also the mixture of museums every year that they come together to compete. So there is a good structure, but also an openness to adjust.
Did you want to add to that?
Yes, the other key aspect is not the individual judgment of the judges, but the fact that it's a jury.
Exactly.
And, you know, the 12 angry men locked in a room, and you can be the Henry Fonda character holding out for your favorite museum. And so the criteria are kind of conjured up like a form of magic every year in those arguments, and they're for me very, very educational. But I think the other thing, and I think you used the phrase best practice, really good museums do better. Best practice isn't good enough. You know, best practice is as far as some other museum has gotten with the thinking, and you can copy it, you can duplicate it, but until you go a bit further, and that's where the analysis and a bit of courage come in, to take a leap beyond everything you've learned from best practice and find a new way of evoking the meaning and the analysis that society needs. And that again is very hard, as Jette says, not to project onto it what you think they should be doing or should be, or meaning. So it's a very, I found it very demanding as an extremely opinionated person to master the art of appreciation that it requires.
And also, I should put the element of contextual analysis. We cannot put all the museums in the same baseline. We need always to reflect on the context where the museums work, their society and their achievements. So it's not easy to compare so many different museums in so many different countries and so many different museum cultures. We have this also in mind, the contextual element.
Yeah, and I think there's some intelligence on this in the book as well. If I can just quote from it, many candidate museums articulate their vision in terms of established and admired museological and social purposes, but it quickly becomes clear whether these have really been embraced or are added on as a sort of garnish, whether there is a discrepancy between the espoused vision and the reality. And I think, to me, that kind of sums up the role of the judges in unpicking, are we getting here the main course, or are we getting something that's just the garnish that's kind of put on top for public presentation? So I hope that answers the questions on that. I'm going to finish with a question from the audience. Jakob's been very patient in waiting for an answer of this, and it's in relation to the point that you made at the beginning, Marlen, about saying, I like the notion of a good museum being one where you feel like a better person leaving than entering, but I find that the most memorable museum visits are often connected with narratives of terror, disaster and inhuman behaviour, whether they're dealing with the Holocaust, war, refugee experiences or others. Can you reflect a bit more on how the museum setting is making us feel a better person after the show? So it's that idea, and this is going to be our last chance to say something. How do we influence and impact visitors, and what does that look like, and feel like what should we be trying to do in that area of influence?
That's why I think just to feel better when you go out of the museum does not reflect exactly the whole picture, and especially museums that deal with difficult subjects, you cannot feel better. You feel very heavy, you feel very moved, and you feel very even traumatized if you are not prepared to face this reality. The way I see better is by being transformed, by having the opportunity to think differently, by being a critical thinker, by opening a new picture in your brain to see the reality in a different way, to question, to bring multiple questions and answers perhaps, and slowly get transformed and become a very active citizen. Never take things for granted. Be always there to question, but also to have good arguments to create interesting debates with your fellow citizens. This is how I see better.
Well, I mean, I'll leave the last word to Jette. I mean, and I agree with everything Marlen said, but I'm looking again at the list of portraits, and my eye falls on Anne Nichols' portrait of the Vasa, which is one of my favorite museums in the world. It's for people who don't know it, it's an almost perfectly preserved 16th century Swedish warship, and it's just stunningly beautiful, fantastically interesting, not particularly challenging in terms of contemporary politics. It could be about mortality or other issues. So there's a whole range of museum experiences, and I think that was one of Kenneth's, I'm resisting the word glib, less rich attempts to summarize what museums can be and do. I think they can do all sorts of things, and there's lots of room for different kinds of museums doing different things. Simply savoring amazing historical moments like that preserved ship. But even they should have a very clear sense of their mission in the contemporary world. And that does take courage above all to think and rethink and find a new role that needs constant renewal. You can't just complacently say, here's the stuff, take it or leave it. That's what we do.
Thank you. I like that idea of rethinking your mission in the contemporary world, no matter what the subject matter. Yes, sir.
I don't know if I have any famous last words here. I've been using a phrase this past year called "in place of denial," and it's quite sort of ambiguous. Is this a place of denial, or what can we do in place of denial? And I personally always found that phrase of Kenneth's a bit too feel good. And I have always been worried that people feel that if they've been through a very serious museum, they've actually done something good. And I don't think being in the museum is a substitute for real action on the issues that are raised. So I would like to do that. And I think denial is one of the concepts that we need to really work with to attain that kind of relevance that we're talking about. One of the subjects we didn't manage to get to today, which is coming up very, very strongly in the current candidates in 2020 and 2021, is the issue of sustainability. And that is one, it's being addressed more broadly out there than the issue of inequality, which I think is the other really important one. But the issue of sustainability is one that museums are taking to across the board, no matter what their type or scale is. So that denial, I feel, is beginning to loosen up.
Fantastic, and I'm really glad that you raised that point about the climate crisis and sustainability. And I think museums do have, every museum has a critical role to play, not just in thinking about its own carbon footprint, but thinking about the role that it can play, engaging its audiences in that conversation and in the action that's needed in order to make their institutions and communities more sustainable. So we're just about on time now. It's been pasted into the chat that the publishers have agreed a discount of 30% with the code RM1230, and that will run for the rest of the year. Please check out the European Museum Forum website if you want any more information about the book or the discount. And I'd just like to end by thanking the panelists today, Mark, Jette and Marlen, as editors of the book, but also for your wise comments and thoughts and contributions. And also to thank all of the writers of the portraits and the chapters in the book, and also Afsin for being our technical support and making everything run so smoothly. Thank you very much. Bye.